The Denver District Attorney charges a 23-year-old man with the murder of his wife. It's our top story on CBS in Denver. Family reported 24-year-old Jasmin Cigarroa missing on March 10th. Her husband, Jonathan Nuno-Mijangos, told police that she had gone out with friends, but investigators say he did that to cover up the crime. According to an arrest affidavit, police used cell phone records to determine he had been in rural Adams County, and that's where they found Cigarroa's body. Nuno-Mijangos is facing murder and tampering charges. Police say he had a history of domestic violence against Cigarroa.
On March 8, 2021, Denver, Colorado. It was a Sunday evening, the kind that most people spend winding down, making dinner, watching something on TV, sending a few last texts before the week begins again. Jasmin Cigarroa was 24 years old. She had spent years building towards something she could be proud of, a master's degree, a career, a life that looked, from the outside, like it was finally coming together. By the end of that night, she would be gone. And the man who had taken her, the man who had shared her bed, her home, her name in marriage, would spend the next 2 days pretending to look for her. Jasmin Cigarroa was born and raised with the kind of quiet determination that doesn't announce itself in big moments, but shows up every single day. She was the daughter of a family that valued hard work and education, and she took those values seriously from a young age. Growing up, Jasmin was described by people who knew her as bright, warm, and deeply caring, the kind of person who remembered the small things about others, who showed up when it mattered, who made the people around her feel seen. She was also ambitious in the most genuine sense of the word. Not ambitious in a way that made her cold or calculating, but ambitious in the way that someone becomes when they genuinely love what they do and want to make a difference. Jasmin had enrolled in a graduate program and was working toward her master's degree, a significant achievement that placed her among a relatively small percentage of people her age who pursue that level of education. She was close to the finish line. The degree was nearly in hand. Friends who knew Jasmin during her graduate school years described a woman who juggled a demanding academic schedule while still making time for the people she loved. She was not someone who let the stress of school isolate her. She kept in touch. She showed up. She remained present in the lives of those who mattered to her, even when her own life was pulling her in multiple directions. By the time she was 24, Jasmin had established herself as someone with a real future ahead of her. She had done everything right, studied hard, pushed through the difficulties, stayed committed to a goal that many people dream about, but few actually see through. The people who loved her were proud of her. More than that, they were excited for her. Excited to see what came next. Excited to watch her step into the version of herself she had worked so hard to become. What they didn't know, what many people outside the walls of her marriage didn't fully understand, was that Jasmin's home life told a very different story. Her husband was a man named Jonathan Nuno-Mijangos. On the surface, the marriage may have appeared unremarkable. Two young people building a life together in Denver. But beneath that surface, investigators would later find evidence of something far more troubling, a pattern of abuse that had been building, quietly and dangerously, for some time before the night of March 8th. Domestic violence rarely begins with violence. That's one of the most important and least understood truths about it. It tends to begin with control, small at first, almost invisible. A comment here, a restriction there, a slow erosion of the other person's sense of self, their independence, their confidence that they have the right to make their own choices. By the time the physical violence begins, the person experiencing it has often been so worn down that they no longer trust their own perception of what is happening to them. Jasmin's case would come to reflect this pattern in stark and heartbreaking detail. The days leading up to March 8, 2021, are not fully documented in public record, but what investigators would later establish is that Jasmin's marriage had become dangerous. There were warning signs. There were people in her life who were worried. And there was, at minimum, a history within that relationship that made what ultimately happened both a tragedy and, in retrospect, a grim inevitability. On March 8th, a Sunday, Jasmin was last seen alive. The exact circumstances of what transpired inside the apartment she shared with Jonathan Nuno-Mijangos on that night would become the central question of a criminal investigation. But what is known is that she did not make it through that night. By March 9th, she was no longer responding to messages. For Jasmin, who kept in regular contact with friends and family, this was unusual. It was the kind of silence that people noticed immediately. She wasn't someone who went quiet. She wasn't someone who disappeared. Her circle began to reach out. Texts went unanswered, calls went to voicemail. The silence grew heavier with each passing hour. On March 10th, 2021, 2 days after Jasmin was last seen alive, Jonathan Nuno-Mijangos filed a missing persons report with Denver police. He told them his wife was gone, that he didn't know where she was, that he was worried about her, that he needed help finding her. It was a performance. Investigators would later determine that at the time Jonathan Nuno-Mijangos filed that report, he already knew exactly where Jasmin was. He had put her there. The filing of a missing persons report by the person responsible for a victim's death is not unheard of in domestic homicide cases. In fact, it follows a recognizable pattern, one that law enforcement has become increasingly skilled at identifying. The report creates the illusion of concern. It puts the killer in the role of worried partner. It redirects attention away from the home and onto some fictional alternative explanation for the victim's absence. And in the immediate aftermath of a disappearance, before investigators have had time to gather evidence, it can be surprisingly effective. But it rarely holds up for long. When police began looking into Jasmin's disappearance, they did what investigators do in every missing persons case that doesn't have an obvious explanation. They started close and worked outward. They talked to people who knew her. They looked at her phone records. They examined the circumstances of her life. And the more they looked, the more Jonathan Nuno-Mijangos' story began to develop problems. Before we continue, show some support by liking this video, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell. It really means a lot and helps the channel grow. Okay, now let's continue. His account of what had happened, of where Jasmin had gone, of when he had last seen her, of the state of their relationship, didn't align with what investigators were finding. There were inconsistencies, small ones at first, the kind that might be explained by stress or grief or the fog of a frightening situation. But they accumulated, and as they accumulated, the picture that emerged was not of a worried husband, but of a man trying very hard to control a narrative that was already beginning to slip away from him. Investigators also began hearing from neighbors. People who lived in proximity to the apartment that Jasmin and Jonathan shared reported hearing things that concerned them. Sounds that suggested a physical altercation, noise consistent with a struggle. Nobody had called the police in the moment. That is itself not unusual. Many people who hear something alarming in a neighboring unit hesitate, second-guess themselves, decide it's not their place. But what they heard, and when they heard it, would become significant in building the timeline of what had actually happened to Jasmin. Part 4. The Discovery. On March 12, 2021, 4 days after Jasmin was last seen alive, investigators made the grim discovery they had feared. Her body was found in a remote area of Adams County, Colorado, a location that was not random, not accidental, but deliberately chosen. Someone had taken Jasmin there and left her. Someone had tried to hide what they had done. The manner of her death was later confirmed. Jasmin Cigarroa had been strangled. Strangulation is one of the most intimate forms of violence. It requires sustained physical contact. It is not a momentary act of uncontrolled rage. It takes time, and it takes deliberate physical effort. In domestic violence cases, a history of non-fatal strangulation is now recognized by researchers and law enforcement alike as one of the most significant indicators of future lethal violence. A victim who has been strangled by a partner is statistically far more likely to be killed by that partner than a victim who has not been strangled. It is, in the grim language of risk assessment, a near-terminal warning sign. Whether Jasmin had been strangled before the night of March 8th is not established in the public record. What is established is that she was strangled on that night in a manner that left no doubt about the cause of her death. The location where her body was found, a remote area of Adams County, spoke to an act of deliberate concealment. Whoever had taken her there had not panicked and left her close by. They had transported her, found a place they believed would be remote enough to delay discovery, and left her there. It was, investigators would come to understand, the act of someone who had thought about what came after, someone trying to buy time, trying to create distance between themselves and what they had done. It did not work. Phone records are among the most powerful investigative tools available to modern law enforcement, and they played a significant role in this case. Cell phone data can establish location. It can show movement. It can contradict timelines. And in a case where a man was filing a missing persons report while his wife's body lay in a field in Adams County, the phones told a story that the words did not. Investigators used phone tracking data as part of their effort to understand what had happened to Jasmin and where her body might be. The combination of that data and the accumulating inconsistencies in Jonathan Nuno-Mijangos' account ultimately directed law enforcement toward Adams County and toward the discovery of March 12th. The evidence that investigators assembled was both physical and testimonial. There was the witness testimony about sounds heard in the apartment. There was the phone data. There was the location of the body, remote but findable once you knew where to look. There was the evidence of a marriage with a documented history of tension and, investigators concluded, a history of abuse. Taken together, it pointed in one direction. Jonathan Nuno-Mijangos was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was also charged with assault, tampering with a body, and abuse of a corpse. The latter two charges reflecting the actions he had taken after Jasmin's death, the attempt to conceal what he had done, to move her body, to make her disappearance look like something other than what it was. The case against Jonathan Nuno-Mijangos moved through the Colorado court system over the years that followed Jasmin's murder. Cases of this nature take time. There is evidence to be processed, legal motions to be filed, hearings to be held. For Jasmin's family, that time was its own kind of suffering. Justice delayed is not justice withheld, but it is a prolonged wound. Every hearing is a reopening. Every delay is another period of waiting in a grief that never fully lets go. In 2024, nearly 3 years after Jasmin Cigarroa's body was found in Adams County, Jonathan Nuno-Mijangos was convicted. The jury found him guilty, and the court delivered its sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will not get out. He will spend the remainder of his natural life inside a prison cell, which is precisely where the law determined he belongs. For Jasmin's family, the conviction brought something. Closure is perhaps too clean a word for what a verdict like this provides. It brought accountability. It brought the formal recognition by the legal system that what happened to Jasmin was a crime, that someone was responsible for it, and that that person would be held to answer for it for the rest of his life. Whether that is enough, whether anything is ever enough after something like this, is not a question the law can answer. Jasmin Cigarroa's murder did not happen in a vacuum. It was not random. It was not the result of a stranger's violence or an unpredictable act of chaos. It was the result of a relationship that had become dangerous, a marriage in which power had been weaponized, in which the person who was supposed to protect her became the person she most needed protection from. Domestic violence remains one of the most underreported and least understood forms of violent crime. The reasons for this are complex and have been studied extensively by researchers, advocates, and law enforcement professionals. Victims often stay in dangerous relationships for reasons that are deeply rational: economic dependence, fear of escalation, concern for children, social pressure, the manipulation of the abuser, the erosion of self-trust that abuse produces over time. The question most commonly asked about domestic violence victims, why didn't they leave, misunderstands the dynamics of the situation almost entirely. The more useful question, and the question that researchers have increasingly focused on, is What conditions allowed the danger to escalate this far? In Jasmin's case, the danger escalated to murder. She was 24 years old. She was nearly finished with her master's degree. She had her whole life in front of her, and she was taken from the people who loved her by a man who had no right to make that decision, no right to end what she had built, no right to take from the world a person it very much needed. The neighbors who heard something and didn't call, the friends who noticed she had gone quiet and felt the first waves of fear, the family who waited for news that never brought her back. These are the human residues of a case like this, the people who live on the other side of it, who carry it forward into their own lives, who are never entirely free of the weight of what happened. And Jasmin herself, a woman who deserved better than what she got, who deserved to finish her degree, to build her career, to find out what her life would become. She deserved all of that, and more. In the aftermath of a murder like this, it is easy for the victim to become defined entirely by how they died. The case becomes the story. The crime becomes the identity. And in some sense, that is unavoidable. We are talking about this because of what happened to her, and what happened to her is inseparable from who she was. But Jasmin Cigarroa was not a murder victim first. She was a person first. She was a daughter, a friend, a student, a young woman with plans and dreams and specific, irreplaceable qualities that the people who knew her will carry in memory for the rest of their lives. She was funny in ways that specific friends will remember. She was thoughtful in ways that specific conversations will preserve. She was real in all the fullness that that word implies. The legal system did its job. Jonathan Nuno-Mijangos was convicted. He is spending the rest of his life in prison. That is justice in the formal sense, the mechanism of accountability that we build institutions to deliver. But the fuller justice, the one where Jasmin gets to finish her degree, step into her career, find out what the next 20 years of her life hold, that justice is not available. It never will be. That is the real cost of domestic violence, and it is paid not by the systems we build to respond to it, but by the people it takes from us. Jasmin Cigarroa deserved better. She worked for it, she earned it, and she was denied it by someone who should have been on her side. Her name is worth remembering, not as a case number, not as a statistic in a report about domestic homicide, as a person, as Jasmin, who was here, who mattered, and who should still be here today.